Imagine this. A child stands in the center of a crowded living room, arms outstretched, eyes wide with the desperate electricity of someone who has just discovered something extraordinary. Around them, the world continues. Its indifferent rotation. Adults scroll through glowing screens. Conversations drift past like smoke. The television mutters its endless monologue to no one in particular. The child speaks, then speaks louder, then screams with the voice of someone drowning in plain sight. And still, nothing. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, no confirmation that they exist at all. Eventually, the child's arms fall. The light in their eyes dims to something else, something quieter, more dangerous. They learn the most devastating lesson a human being can learn: that their presence in the world is optional, that their inner life is irrelevant, that the price of belonging is disappearance. Now imagine that this child is you, or perhaps it was you, or perhaps it still is you decades later, standing in different rooms with the same invisible chains wrapped around your voice. Today, we'll explore the hidden wounds of those who grew up ignored, and how these silent scars echo into adulthood, affecting confidence, trust, love, and even the way one perceives reality. And as we move through this exploration, stay with me until the end, because the final revelation might completely change the way you see yourself and others who carry invisible pain. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. This video dives deep into the roots of emotional neglect and how to break free from its silent grasp. The insights you'll hear today might open doors to understanding parts of your own story you've never dared to face. And trust me, the last part of this journey is the most powerful of all. Here's the paradox that should terrify you. The most profound form of abandonment doesn't happen when someone leaves. It happens when they stay but refuse to see you. Physical presence without psychological recognition creates a unique form of torture. You cannot grieve what was never acknowledged as lost. You cannot heal from a wound that has no name. The ignored child grows into an adult who feels perpetually ghost-like, floating through relationships and achievements with the haunting suspicion that they're not quite real, that at any moment, someone might look directly through them and confirm their deepest fear, that they never mattered at all. But here's what makes this truly insidious emotional neglect wears the disguise of normalcy. There are no bruises to photograph, no dramatic incidents to report, no clear villains to blame. The ignored child often grows up in homes that look perfectly functional from the outside. Food on the table, roof overhead, parents who would insist they did everything right. And this makes the wound invisible not just to others, but to the victim themselves. How do you articulate an absence? How do you mourn something that was never given a chance to exist? The question that should be burning in your mind right now is this: what happens to a human soul that learns it must earn the basic acknowledgement of its existence? What psychological architecture gets built in a mind that discovers love is not a given, but a reward for perfect invisibility? The answer is more complex and more tragic than you might imagine. Because the ignored child doesn't simply become sad or angry, they become a masterpiece of adaptation, a human being who learns to survive by fracturing themselves into pieces. One piece that performs for the world, seamlessly reading rooms and molding itself into whatever shape might finally elicit recognition. Another piece that retreats so far inward it forgets how to speak its own truth. And a third piece, perhaps the most heartbreaking, that watches from behind the glass of consciousness, observing its own life as if it belongs to someone else, waiting for permission to finally be real. This is not a story about weak people who couldn't handle their childhood. This is a story about the extraordinary resilience required to survive a form of psychological erasure that most people cannot even name. The ignored child develops capabilities that border on supernatural, the ability to read micro-expressions, to sense emotional shifts in a room before anyone speaks, to navigate complex social dynamics with the precision of someone whose survival depended on it. Because it did. But here's the cruel twist. These same survival skills become their prison. The hypervigilance that once kept them safe now keeps them exhausted. The ability to disappear that once protected them now prevents genuine connection. The emotional radar that made them so attuned to others has rendered them utterly deaf to themselves. So ask yourself, and answer honestly. Because no one is watching, do you know what you actually feel right now? Not what you should feel, not what makes sense to feel, but what you genuinely feel in the raw, unedited depths of your being. If you had to pause, if you had to think about it, if the answer feels fuzzy or distant or somehow theoretical, then you already know the truth. Some part of you learned a long time ago that your emotions were dangerous, excessive, inconvenient. Some part of you is still that child in the crowded room, arms at your sides, voice swallowed, waiting for someone to finally look up and see you. But what if I told you that the very thing you're waiting for, that moment of external validation, that recognition from someone else, is the one thing that will never heal this wound? What if the person who needs to finally see you has been standing in front of you all along, and you've been looking right through them with the same indifference you once received? The psychology of the ignored child is not just a story about the past. It's a story about right now, about this moment, about the way you're reading these words, while some part of you wonders if they're really about you, if you're allowed to claim this pain, if maybe you're being dramatic and someone else has it worse, and you should just be grateful for what you had. That voice, that dismissive, minimizing voice, is not your voice. It never was. It's the echo of every moment your emotions were met with silence, every time your tears were answered with annoyance, every instance your joy was too loud or your sadness too heavy or your very existence too much. And until you understand where that voice came from, it will continue to run your life from the shadows, making decisions you don't consciously agree with, sabotaging connections you desperately want, and ensuring that the ignored child inside you remains ignored now by the one person who had the power to finally set them free. To understand why emotional neglect carves such deep grooves into the human psyche, you must first grasp a fundamental truth that psychology and philosophy have been circling for centuries. Identity is not discovered, it is mirrored. You do not come into this world knowing who you are. You learn it by seeing yourself reflected in the eyes of others, particularly those who hold your survival in their hands. When a parent looks at a child with genuine interest, responds to their emotions with empathy, and treats their inner world as something worthy of attention, they are essentially saying, "You are real. What you feel matters. You exist." This mirroring process is not a luxury. It is the foundation upon which the entire architecture of self is built. Dr. Jonas Webb, whose work on emotional neglect has illuminated this invisible wound for thousands, describes it as a failure to notice, attend to, or respond appropriately to a child's feelings. But let's go deeper than the clinical language. What this really means is that the child's emotional reality is treated as if it doesn't exist. Their tears might as well be silent. Their joy might as well be invisible. Their fear, their excitement, their confusion, all of it falls into a void where no echo returns. And in that void, something catastrophic happens. The child learns that their internal experience has no value, no weight, no legitimacy in the external world. Carl Jung understood this fragmentation intimately when he wrote about the shadow self, the repository of everything we must repress to remain acceptable to those around us. For the ignored child, the shadow becomes enormous, bloated with every emotion that was deemed too much, every need that was inconvenient, every authentic expression that met with indifference. The true self, spontaneous, feeling, vulnerable, gets buried alive. And in its place rises what Donald Winnicott called the false self, a carefully constructed performance designed to minimize disruption, maximize approval, and above all, avoid the unbearable pain of being seen and still dismissed. But here's where the philosophy becomes crucial. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of ressentiment, a deep-seated resentment that arises when one is powerless to express natural reactions and must instead internalize them. The ignored child experiences this in its purest form. They cannot rage against their caregivers. They cannot demand better. They cannot even fully articulate what's being withheld, because it's not a thing that's missing. It's a presence, an attention, a psychological attunement that never materialized. So the resentment turns inward. The child doesn't think, "My parents are failing me." They think, "I must be failing at being lovable." This is the hidden problem that most people never identify. Emotional neglect teaches you that the problem is you, not your circumstances, not the limitations of your caregivers, but something fundamentally defective in your being. You become convinced that if you were just better, quieter, more independent, less needy, more impressive, then maybe you would finally deserve the attention that comes effortlessly to others. This belief system becomes the lens through which you interpret every subsequent relationship, every rejection, every moment of disconnection. You are always the problem. The solution is always to be less. Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps and went on to develop logotherapy, observed that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. But the ignored child faces a unique torture. Suffering without recognition is suffering without meaning. When your pain is invisible to those around you, when your emotional world is treated as if it doesn't exist, you cannot make sense of your own experience. You begin to doubt your own reality. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe everyone feels this way and I'm just weak for letting it bother me. This is gaslighting at its most subtle and most damaging, not through malicious intent, but through absence. The child learns to gaslight themselves, to dismiss their own perceptions, to minimize their own needs before anyone else has the chance to do it for them. They become their own emotional neglector, continuing the pattern long after they've left the original environment. The prison becomes portable, the chains become invisible. And the tragedy is that they don't even know they're imprisoned, because this is the only reality they've ever known. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a predetermined nature, but rather create ourselves through our choices and experiences. But what happens when your formative experiences teach you that you don't have the right to exist fully? That your essence must be minimized, edited, suppressed? You end up living what Sartre might call a life of bad faith, denying your own freedom and authenticity because acknowledging it would mean confronting the unbearable reality of what was stolen from you. The ignored child grows into an adult who mistakes their learned invisibility for their true nature. They think, I'm just not the kind of person who needs much attention, or I prefer to keep things to myself. But these aren't authentic preferences, they're survival adaptations that have calcified into identity. And beneath them, buried under years of conditioning, is a human being who desperately wants to be seen but has forgotten how to allow it. Now watch how this hidden wound operates in the adult world, silently shaping every interaction, every choice, every relationship with the precision of invisible architecture. The consequences of emotional neglect don't announce themselves. They masquerade as personality traits, as relationship patterns, as inexplicable anxiety that has no clear origin. You don't wake up one day and realize you've been living under the influence of childhood neglect. Instead, you find yourself repeatedly in situations that feel eerily familiar, relationships where you give endlessly but feel perpetually unseen, jobs where you overperform yet remain unacknowledged, friendships where you're the eternal listener but never the one being heard. This is what psychologists call repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate early trauma in the desperate hope that this time the outcome will be different. But here's the neurological reality that makes this pattern so insidious. Your brain has been wired to find comfort in the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. The ignored child's developing neural pathways learn to expect indifference, and so the adult brain actually feels safer in relationships that replicate that dynamic. When someone shows up consistently, when they're genuinely interested in your inner world, when they offer the very attention you claim to want, it triggers alarm bells. This doesn't feel like love. It feels wrong, overwhelming, suspicious. Because love, in your earliest imprinting, looked like absence. Dr. Gabor Mate, whose work on trauma has revealed its pervasive influence on human behavior, explains that the essence of trauma is disconnection from ourselves, from others, from the world. For the emotionally neglected adult, this disconnection becomes their baseline state of being. They move through life with a subtle but constant sense of unreality, as if they're watching themselves from a distance, never fully inhabiting their own experience. They struggle with what therapists call alexithymia, the inability to identify and describe emotions. When asked, "How do you feel?" they genuinely don't know. The question itself feels foreign, almost absurd, because no one ever taught them that feelings were information worth processing, and so they become emotional observers rather than participants. They can read a room with extraordinary precision, detect the slightest shift in someone else's mood, anticipate needs before they're spoken, but their own emotional landscape remains terra incognita, unexplored and unnamed. This creates what Alice Miller described in The Drama of the Gifted Child, the development of a kind of hypervigilant empathy that is simultaneously their greatest strength and their deepest wound. They give and give and give, not from abundance, but from the learned belief that their value lies in their usefulness to others. In romantic relationships, this manifests as a particularly cruel pattern. The ignored child becomes the adult who confuses intensity with intimacy, who mistakes emotional unavailability for mystery, who stays in relationships that starve them while convincing themselves they're not that hungry anyway. They're drawn to partners who mirror their original wound, people who are distant, distracted, emotionally withholding, not because they consciously want to suffer, but because their nervous system has been conditioned to interpret indifference as normal and genuine attention as threatening or false. John Bowlby's attachment theory explains this through the lens of avoidant attachment, a defensive strategy where closeness feels dangerous and dependency feels like weakness. But it goes deeper than strategy. It's a fundamental belief that you must handle everything alone because no one is truly coming. That belief gets reinforced every time you don't ask for help, every time you minimize your needs, every time you say, "I'm fine," when you're drowning. You're not just protecting yourself from disappointment, you're fulfilling a prophecy that was written in your neural circuitry before you had words to question it. The professional realm offers no escape from this pattern. Some become high achievers, pouring themselves into success with the unconscious hope that achievement will finally make them visible. But no amount of accomplishment fills the void, because what they're really seeking isn't recognition. It's the emotional attunement they never received. Others go the opposite direction, underperforming and self-sabotaging, living out the internalized belief that they don't deserve to take up space. Both extremes are different expressions of the same wound, the terror of visibility coupled with the agony of invisibility. Perhaps most devastatingly, the ignored child becomes an adult who doesn't know how to receive. Compliments feel uncomfortable. Genuine interest feels suspicious. Someone wanting to truly know them triggers panic, because being known means being vulnerable. And vulnerability means risking the annihilating experience of being seen and still dismissed. So they deflect, minimize, change the subject, turn the attention back to the other person, anything, to avoid the unbearable intimacy of being witnessed. But here's where everything shifts. Here's where the narrative you've been living, the one written by absence, by silence, by all those moments when no one looked up, begins to crack open. Because the most radical act available to the ignored child turned adult is not to finally get someone else to see them. It's to stop waiting for external validation and begin the revolutionary work of seeing themselves. This is not the self-help platitude it might sound like. This is psychological insurgency. This is the deliberate dismantling of a survival system that has been running your life from the shadows for decades. And it begins with a single terrifying act: awareness without judgment. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The ignored child has been living under the tyranny of unconscious programming, repeating patterns they never chose, inhabiting a personality that was constructed for them rather than by them. The first step of rebellion is to name what was never named, to look directly at the truth and say, "I was emotionally neglected, not because I was unworthy, but because the people responsible for my emotional development were themselves wounded, limited, or simply absent in ways that had nothing to do with my value." This naming is crucial because emotional neglect thrives in the shadowlands of denial and minimization. The moment you stop telling yourself, "It wasn't that bad," or "Other people had it worse," or "My parents did their best," the moment you allow yourself to acknowledge the reality of what was absent, you reclaim your right to your own experience. You stop gaslighting yourself on behalf of people who never took responsibility for their impact. But awareness alone is not enough. The next phase requires what Kristen Neff calls self-compassion, the practice of treating yourself with the same tenderness, understanding, and patience you would offer a dear friend. For someone conditioned to believe their emotions are burdens, this feels almost transgressive. It means pausing when you're overwhelmed instead of pushing through. It means comforting yourself when you're sad instead of dismissing it as weakness. It means setting boundaries that protect your peace even when it disappoints others. This is reparenting, giving yourself what you never received. And it's not metaphorical. Neuroscience has shown that the brain remains plastic throughout life, capable of forming new neural pathways that can override old programming. Every time you respond to your own distress with kindness instead of criticism, you're literally rewiring your nervous system. Every time you pause to ask yourself, "What do I actually feel right now?" you're building the neural infrastructure for emotional self-awareness that was never built in childhood. The rebellion also requires confronting your relationship patterns with ruthless honesty. Who are you drawn to and why? If you keep finding yourself with emotionally unavailable people, it's not bad luck. It's your wounded self seeking the familiar. The breakthrough comes when you start choosing differently, when you allow yourself to be attracted to emotional safety even though it feels boring or strange or somehow less real than the dramatic push-pull you've known. This is where you break the repetition compulsion, where you finally write a different ending. And perhaps most importantly, you must learn to speak. Not the polished, people-pleasing speech you've perfected, but the raw, unedited truth of your inner experience. This might mean saying, "I feel hurt," instead of, "It's fine." It might mean admitting, "I need support," instead of handling everything alone. It might mean risking the vulnerability of being honest about what you want, even knowing you might be dismissed again. Because here's the paradox. The only way to discover who will truly see you is to allow yourself to be seeable. Bessel van der Kolk reminds us in The Body Keeps the Score that trauma lives in the body, but so does healing. The ignored child learned to freeze, to hold their breath, to make themselves small. The rebellious adult must reclaim their physical presence through movement, through breath, through the simple revolutionary act of taking up space without apologizing for it. This is embodied liberation, the kind that can't be intellectualized but must be practiced until your nervous system finally believes it's safe to exist fully. Now we arrive at the deepest truth, the one that will either liberate you completely or haunt you until you're ready to accept it. Everything you've learned so far, the wound, the patterns, the rebellion, has been leading to this single revelation that changes everything. Are you ready? Here it is. The person you've been waiting to see you has been standing in front of a mirror your entire life, and you've been looking right through them with the same indifference you once received. Let that land. Let it disturb you. Because this is the ultimate paradox of the ignored child. In your desperate search for someone to finally acknowledge your existence, you became the very thing you feared most, the one who ignores you. Every time you dismissed your own feelings as dramatic, every time you minimized your own needs as selfish, every time you told yourself to just get over it or that others had it worse, you were recreating the original wound. You became both the neglected child and the neglectful parent, trapped in an internal dynamic that no external validation could ever resolve. This is what makes emotional neglect so devastatingly self-perpetuating. You don't just carry the wound, you actively maintain it. You've been waiting for someone to give you permission to matter, when the only permission that was ever needed was your own. You've been seeking proof of your worthiness in the eyes of others, when the only proof that could ever satisfy you is the moment you decide, unilaterally and without external confirmation, that you are worthy simply because you exist. Søren Kierkegaard understood this when he wrote about the concept of selfhood, that becoming yourself is not a discovery but a choice, an act of will that requires you to take responsibility for your own existence, rather than waiting for the world to validate it. The ignored child spends their life in what Kierkegaard might call despair, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet despair of refusing to be yourself, of living in perpetual dependence on external recognition to feel real. But here's where it gets even deeper, where the revelation becomes almost unbearably powerful. What if your emotional neglect, as devastating as it was, has actually given you a gift that most people will never possess? What if the very wound you've been trying to heal is also the source of your greatest strength? Think about it. Because you grew up in emotional silence, you developed an extraordinary capacity to hear what others cannot. Your hypervigilance, your ability to read subtle emotional cues, your deep empathy, these aren't just scars. They're superpowers forged in the fire of absence. You know what it feels like to be invisible, which means you have an almost supernatural ability to see others who are suffering in silence. You understand loneliness at a level most people never will, which means you can offer a quality of presence and understanding that feels like salvation to those who receive it. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." But he also understood something more nuanced. Suffering can be transmuted into wisdom if and only if you choose to integrate it rather than be destroyed by it. The ignored child who remains stuck in their wound becomes bitter, isolated, perpetually victimized by a past they cannot change. But the ignored child who faces their wound, who grieves it fully, who allows themselves to feel the rage and sadness and devastating loneliness of what was lost, that person emerges with a depth of emotional intelligence that cannot be taught, only earned through survival. This is the alchemy of trauma. Lead into gold, wound into wisdom, absence into presence. But it only works if you stop abandoning yourself. It only works if you become the witness you never had. And here's the most beautiful and terrifying part of this truth. The moment you truly see yourself, not the performance, not the false self, not the carefully constructed persona, but the raw, vulnerable, imperfect human being beneath all the armor, something miraculous happens. You stop needing others to validate your existence because you finally understand that existence is not something that requires validation. You are. That's enough. That's everything. And here's the final twist that might just shatter everything you thought you knew. Being ignored didn't happen to you, it happened for you. Not because you deserved it, not because it was some cosmic lesson you needed to learn, but because the universe is neither cruel nor kind, it simply is. And within that neutral reality, you have the power to decide what your suffering means. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it forge you into someone capable of a depth of love, presence, and emotional authenticity that most people never achieve. The ignored child inside you is not a weakness to overcome. They are the doorway to your most authentic self. They are the keeper of your deepest truths, your unmet needs, your unexpressed emotions. And they have been waiting, not for someone else to save them, but for you to turn around, to kneel down, to look them in the eyes and say, I see you, I've always seen you, and I'm never leaving you again. So here's your final question, the one that will determine everything that comes after this moment. If you truly believe that you are worthy of love not because of what you do, not because of how useful you are, not because of how well you read the room or how little space you take up, but simply because you breathe, how would you live differently starting right now? Don't answer quickly. Sit with it. Let it echo in the empty spaces where you've been hiding. Because that question is not just reflection, it's transformation. It's the moment when the ignored child finally becomes the seen adult. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. To have once been invisible and to now exist fully, courageously, unapologetically. The silence doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning, the moment when you finally learn to hear your own voice above all the noise. And when you do, when you truly listen to yourself with the attention and compassion you once craved from others, you'll discover something extraordinary. You were never actually invisible. You were just looking in the wrong direction. If this resonated with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling your story. Because when one person finds their voice, it gives permission for others to do the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the silence finally ends.